patria o muerte.
Episode 1, The Return of Empire. 1. The Pause. There was a moment, brief, fragile, almost laughable in hindsight, when humanity believed it had escaped history. It was the early 1990s, a time that now feels less like a historical era and more like a collective hallucination. The Soviet Union did not end with a nuclear flash or a grand final stand. It dissolved in the rustling of paperwork and the scratching of pens in freezing committee rooms. In capitals across the world, flags were lowered not in surrender, but in administrative obsolescence. The maps were redrawn with the casual confidence of architects renovating a house that had already burned down. In the universities of the West, economists declared a permanent victory. Philosophers, drunk on the sudden silence of the guns, announced the end of history. Political scientists, men who had spent careers studying the calculus of mutually assured destruction, suddenly spoke with the relaxed confidence of those who had mistaken a pause for a conclusion. The world, they told us, had learned its lesson. In the glass towers of New York, London, and Brussels, the consensus solidified into dogma. No more empires. No more annexations. No more wars of conquest. Those were relics of a barbaric past, destined for the museum alongside the steam engine and the guillotine. The future was simple: cooperation. Markets. Institutions. Rules. A multilateral world. And for a time, beneath the fluorescent lights of international summits, it almost looked real. Trade replaced armies. Finance replaced borders. When violence did erupt, it was sanitized by a new, softer lexicon. Wars were rebranded as interventions. Invasions became stabilization missions. Occupation was softened into peacekeeping. The language of the world softened, and with it, the conscience of an entire civilization. We believed that if we changed the words, we had changed the nature of power itself. But beneath the rhetoric, beneath the treaties signed with gold pens and the celebratory champagne toasts, something ancient waited. Because history does not end. It metabolizes. Empires do not disappear. They shed skin. What followed the Cold War was not peace, but latency. A long, deceptive latency where the old impulses of domination hibernated, feeding on the very naivety that declared them dead. 2. The hollowing. The end of the global order, end of global order, was not a sudden collapse. It was not a singular event you could date in a textbook. It was a slow forgetting of why borders existed in the first place. The Cold War had been brutal, a terrified paralysis that spanned decades, but it was stable. The world was a binary architecture, two superpowers. Two spheres of influence. Everyone, from the president in the White House to the peasant in the rice paddy, knew where the lines were. More importantly, everyone knew exactly what would happen if they crossed them. Fear enforced order. When that bipolar structure collapsed, the fear evaporated, and it was replaced by something far more fragile, a belief system. A pious, desperate belief that nations would restrain themselves voluntarily. That power, for the first time in human existence, would submit to law. That economic interdependence, the flow of cheap plastic and digital capital, would override the strategic hunger that had driven kings and emperors for 5,000 years. This belief had a name, multilateralism. And it failed. Not because it was immoral, but because it was unenforceable. The failure was invisible at first. It happened in the quiet decisions of rising powers who looked at the rules and saw not a bind, but a ladder. China did not rise within the system, it rose through it, using the open markets to build a closed fortress. Russia did not integrate, it waited, nursing a humiliation that hardened into a weapon. And the United States, the supposed guarantor of this new paradise, did not relinquish power. It merely outsourced responsibility. The institutions remained, the United Nations, the international courts, the endless summits, but they underwent a ghostly transformation. They became ceremonial. They were rituals without teeth. Courts without armies. Laws without consequences. By the time anyone noticed the rot, the system had already hollowed out. The new era, new Cold War, did not announce itself with a missile launch or a declaration of war. It announced itself with inaction. When Crimea was taken, the response was a flurry of paper, sanctions that inconvenienced but did not stop. When Syria burned, the response was carefully worded statements of concern. When supply chains were weaponized, choking industries halfway across the globe, the response was confusion. The message was clear to anyone paying attention, vibrating through the silence of the West. You can take territory. You can redraw borders. You can ignore sovereignty. As long as you are strong enough. This is the moment, rarely named, but absolutely decisive, when the world crossed a threshold. We stepped out of a failed multilateral order and back into something older. Something colder. Something honest. A return to empire. 3. The tripolar trap. But these were not the old empires of flags and kings, of pith helmets and cavalry charges. These were empires of logistics, resources, demographics, and denial. By the late 2010s, the fog had cleared enough to see the shape of the new reality. 3 gravitational centers had fully emerged, massive and warping the space around them. The United States. Russia. China. They were not allies. They were not enemies in the traditional sense. They were predators circling the same shrinking space. Diplomats tried to call this a balance of power, but they were lying to themselves. This was not a balance, it was a tripolar instability. In game theory, triads are notoriously fragile. A standoff between 2 is stable, it is a line. A standoff between 3 is a chaos engine. 2 will always coordinate against the third, until the configuration flips, and the betrayed becomes the partner. Trust is impossible. Long-term cooperation is irrational. And yet, this is the structure the world slid into, eyes closed, sleepwalking into the trap. The axis of reality became USA China Russia. And each corner of this triangle operated on a fundamentally different imperial logic. The United States, a resource empire, hemispheric by instinct. Its strategists looked at the map and saw flows. Control energy, control trade routes, control financial plumbing. To Washington, Latin America was not a continent of neighbors, it was a backyard. The Atlantic and Pacific were not oceans, they were moats. Russia, a territorial empire, haunted by the specter of collapse. Its logic was born of trauma. It needed buffer zones, frozen conflicts, land as physical security. Moscow looked at the flat expanse of the European plain and felt a visceral panic. Borders must move outward, or the state feels naked. China, a civilizational empire. Patient. Demographic. Infrastructural. Beijing did not play for quarters, it played for centuries. Roads, ports, debts, population flows. Territory mattered, yes, but absorption mattered more. Why conquer a city when you can own its economy, its data, and its future? None of them respected sovereignty as a principle. They respected it only as a temporary condition. The rest of the world, Europe, Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, existed in a dangerous illusion, that they were still players at the table, not terrain on the board. 4. The memo. And then came the memo. It was never meant to be public. It was a strategic planning document, circulated within a narrow, airless circle of defense and intelligence officials in Washington. It was written in the dry, bloodless language of the technocrat. Neutral tone. No ideology. No drama. Just geography. Just risk. Just inevitability. The document analyzed the Arctic. It detailed the physics of a melting world, receding ice sheets, opening shipping lanes where none had existed for millennia, the vulnerability of submarine cables carrying the world's data. It mapped early warning systems and missile defense geometry. It calculated the control of the North Atlantic Gap. And at the center of it all, it circled a single island, Iceland. A sovereign nation. Democratic. Peaceful. Neutral. And strategically intolerable. The memo's core argument was brutally simple, a paragraph that stripped away 50 years of diplomatic pretense. In a multipolar imperial environment, non-aligned strategic nodes cannot remain independent indefinitely. If the United States does not assert control over Iceland, either the Russian Federation or the People's Republic of China will do so, directly or indirectly, within the next strategic cycle. There was no moral language. No legal justification. Just probability. And then came the line that would later leak, circulate on encrypted channels, and quietly terrify diplomats across the world. Preemptive annexation may constitute the least destabilizing outcome. The Iceland crisis did not begin with troops landing on a beach. It began with logic. This was the Trump doctrine in its purest form. Not the tweets, Not the personality, not the rallies, but the structural response to a decaying system. Trump did not invent this reality. He simply articulated it without shame. His worldview was not diplomatic, it was transactional. It was not idealistic, it was territorial. He looked at the globe and saw that the world was not a community. It was a board. And on that board, pieces were being taken. The logic was suffocating. If the United States hesitated, it would lose. If it respected borders, others would not. If it obeyed the rules of the 1990s, it would be punished for its restraint. From this perspective, annexation was not aggression. It was defense. The #Trump doctrine was not about America first as a patriotic slogan, it was about America alone as a terminal prognosis. 5. The collapse of illusion. Once you accept that premise, that law is dead and only force remains, the rest follows with terrifying coherence. If Iceland must be taken to deny the Arctic to rivals. If Ukraine can fall because Europe cannot act. If Taiwan is only a matter of time. Then resources become the next front. Venezuela ceased to be a failed state in this logic. It became a stockpile. It was simply oil that could not be allowed to fall into Chinese or Russian hands. Latin America ceased to be a collection of sovereign nations. It became a sphere. A hemisphere. A legacy. A fortress to be barred against the East. And Europe? Europe appeared in the analysis as tired. A museum guarded by treaties written for a world that no longer exists. In this emerging order, Europe does not fall with an invasion. It falls with dependency. It falls when the gas stops flowing. It falls when the demographics shift. It falls when it realizes it has outsourced its security to an empire that no longer cares to provide it. Ukraine was not an anomaly. It was a signal. Geopolitics explained rarely sounds like this in public. But this is how it sounds in rooms without cameras. The terrifying part is not that this logic exists. It's that it works. It predicts behavior. It explains the silence of the great powers. It makes sense of the cruelty on the news. And it leaves one question hanging in the air, unasked, but unavoidable, hovering like smoke in the corridors of power. If the world is returning to empire, and if small and medium states cannot survive alone, then what happens to the rest? What happens to Africa, fragmented and extracted for its minerals? To Latin America, divided and pressured by the colossus to the north? To Southern Europe, aging, exposed, and economically adrift? What happens when the board fills up? 6. The ghost. The memo ended with a footnote. It was barely a paragraph, inserted almost as historical trivia by an analyst looking for precedent. It mentioned that global unifications have occurred before, not ideologically, but structurally. Trade empires. Maritime empires. Empires that did not conquer continents in one piece, but stitched them together across oceans. One example is given. Almost casually. The Portuguese ultramarine system represented a transcontinental administrative network linking South America, Africa, and Europe for over 4 centuries. There was no emphasis. No follow-up. Just a ghost. A forgotten prototype. But somewhere, far from Washington, far from the paranoia of Moscow, far from the patient planning of Beijing, a woman sits in a quiet room. The light is low. She is reading the same patterns, not in classified memos, but in the sediment of history. She is not a general. She is not a president. But she sees what the empires have forgotten. She understands that scale can be defensive. She understands that unity can be survival. She understands that the future may belong not to those who dominate, but to those who outgrow the game entirely. But that story has not begun yet. For now, the world stands on the edge of a truth it does not want to name. The silence of the 1990s is over. The noise of the future is beginning to rise. The age of nations is ending. And the age of empire has already returned.